Hello, this is DM Rob G, and welcome to DM Rob's Reviews, or rather, welcome to a editorial. Now, I know I just started my YouTube channel again, but something has been bugging me. Granted, most of what I'm about to say I got from the Black People Twitter subreddit, but I think the posters there are correct about the movie Cleopatra, or rather about the casting in the movie Cleopatra. But I think the posters there are correct, and while this is not the worst decision they could have ever made, it is still quite tasteless in my opinion. I see it as, despite them casting a black woman in the lead role of Cleopatra, this decision can actually come off as anti-feminist. Truth is, there is absolutely a dearth of black characters on TV and movies, especially ones cast in historic roles. But when you really get down to something like Cleopatra, Egyptologist Sally Ann Ashton of Cambridge University has basically reconstructed her face using artifacts of the time period. Now, we also know that she has Greek ancestry, making her more olive-skinned than dark-skinned, making her more olive-skinned with red hair rather than dark-skinned. We also know that she doesn't really have any direct African ancestry. Essentially, we've Africanized a Greek woman with red hair. While this might not seem like a problem, we're essentially ignoring every other African queen in order to make this cast decision, even as we pat ourselves on the back for being inclusive. For example, we're essentially creating an alternate history, portraying it as real rather than showing history as it is. For example, Nefertiti is shown to have black skin. According to Egyptologist Sigrid, I gotta get this right, Sigrid Holel Hoenis, her skin color was warp-shifted because her skin echoed the color of fertile earth as well as the netherworld and death. She was known for the overhaul of state religious policy as well as turning Egypt into a monotheistic religion based around the sun disk during one of the wealthiest points in ancient Egypt's history. By the way, the ancient Egyptian word for its own country was Kemet. So I'm going to be using Kemet from now on to refer to ancient Egypt. Frankly, I can't think of anything more empowering. However, look at what Netflix did instead. It allows Tina Garavi to take a historical figure and say she might have been black, as well as give the explanation of, well, we don't know her skin color, it just wasn't white. Despite that, again, statues and coins at the time looked more like this. Notice how her hair on the statue is not one of the types of hair attributed to African ancestry, which tends to be thicker and curlier than hair found in, say, I don't know, the Middle East. This is actually one of the reasons why Annie Malone and Madam C.J. Walker's hair products were such a success in 1920s America. It was made for the thicker hair of African Americans versus the other hair products at the time, which actually caused severe chemical burns because people were trying to use so much of it because it was just so ineffective. It was effective on Caucasian hair, but not African American hair. On top of all that, the historian Plutarch implies that she actually resided and ruled from Alexandria. Now, keep in mind, during this time, Alexandria is a city that has Greek culture and uses the Greek language. It might be in Kemet, but it is still not a Kemetic city. In fact, Alexandria itself had its start from Alexander the Great, who wanted a city that would basically be as great as he was. When Alexander the Great died, Ptolemy I managed to inherit Egypt as one of Alexander the Great's generals. Ever since then, Ptolemy I started the Ptolemaic dynasty, which Cleopatra is part of. Now, instead of directly addressing Cleopatra's cultural and political isolation, they've chosen to act as if she was one of the people she ruled. This is at the expense of completely ignoring stories of black men and women in Africa itself. We could, for example, have had a show on the Solomonic dynasty, known as the House of Solomon, which ruled the Ethiopian Empire in the 13th century. Their members claim a lineage to King Solomon and Queen of Sheba, and ruled was basically the northwestern quadrant of present-day Ethiopia, which is also known as the Ethiopian Highlands. It expanded and contracted through the years, mind you, again through various acts of warfare. This picture, for example, shows Ethiopia during the 15th century and its tributary kingdom, the kingdom of Funj, in light green. Instead of all that, all we have is the director casting Adelaide James saying, during the research, I realized what a political act it would be to see Cleopatra portrayed by a black actress. Or me, the idea that people had gotten so incredibly wrong before, historically from Theda Bara to Monica Bellucci, and recently Angelina Jolie and Gal Gadot in the running to play her, meant that we had to get even more right. The hunt was on to find the right performer to bring Cleopatra into the 21st century. Which, again, you are taking a leader isolated from her people that basically allied with Rome to kill her sisters. Now, granted, if all that seems to be too difficult, Netflix still could have made a show about African American kingdoms. Perhaps we should look at this series and see that's about a single person's rule and go with, say, Mansa Musa of Mali, who was said to be the world's wealthiest person, not just at that time, but if popular folklore is to be believed, all of history. Now, granted, the extent of his wealth isn't really known, but we can still explore how Mansa broke from Mande tradition, as Mande stories indicate. But then again, Netflix thinks that telling a story with a black actress playing a Greek woman, one that has been told numerous times, and is quite frankly a story of how Egypt was ruled from the outside and conquered by its enemies, instead of, say, Hatshepsut, who was the fifth pharaoh of the 18th dynasty. Hatshepsut ruled as the regent to her son, Thutmose III, who inherited the throne at the age of 2. Well, that is until several years into Thutmose's reign, when she installed herself as co-ruler. To establish herself in the boys' club, Hatshepsut actually wore male robes and a fake beard, effectively forcing herself into the boys' club. Keep in mind, Hatshepsut is actually one of the most prolific builders in Kemetic history, overseeing the construction of the Karnak Temple Complex, the Red Chapel, the Speos Artemidos, and the Mortuary Temple of Hatshepsut. Instead, Netflix decides that it wants to show how powerful African queens can be by having a black actress playing a woman of Macedonian lineage, ruling a country that was conquered militarily by her ancestors, while in a dynasty that was so inbred, Cleopatra was basically created out of flour and yeast and baked in a stone oven. At which point the director states, after much hand-wringing, we found Adelaide James, an actor who could convey the Cleopatra's beauty, but also her strength. But also her strength, what the historians confirm is more likely Cleopatra looked like than Elizabeth Taylor ever did. And as she's saying this, Netflix itself is actually facing a lawsuit in Egypt for erasing Egyptian culture. But even as I stated before, there have been many images of Cleopatra made at the time that have been used to reconstruct her face. Not only that, but we're finding through DNA in mummies that 90% of Kemetic mummies buried between 1380 BC and 425 AD show their closest relatives to from a region in present-day Israel and Jordan rather than Central Africa. And again, I do have to mention that some African pharaohs, namely in the 25th dynasty, were absolutely Central African. But Cleopatra didn't have any, and in fact relied on the political and monetary power of Mark Antony to secure her throne by murdering her sisters. Which, on that note, Cleopatra wasn't that conventionally beautiful either. Her beauty came from her intelligence, which is another aspect many movies don't seem to get. Cleopatra was actually one of the most intelligent rulers on Earth at the time. She was the only member of the Ptolemaic dynasty to speak the Kemetic language, and among other languages, Ethiopian, Median, Parthian, Latin, Arabic, Hebrew, and Syrian. She's basically ruling to an extent Rome's intervention over Egypt on their behalf. Again, I say that phrase lightly because it kind of is. Cleopatra did have her own goals in ruling, but she did not build any monuments, and she would eventually be conquered by Rome, even as she used them for her political and monetary gain. If you really want to feature something that has Africans being strong and standing up to oppression, and considering that Mansa Musa rolled over slave culture, that might leave a bad taste in your mouth, consider the story of Malik Ambar, who was a city military leader, who was bought as a slave and sold in India. Malik Ambar raised a military of over 50,000 men when serving as the regent of the Nizam Shahi dynasty of Ahmednagar from 1600 to 1626. He would lead his armies against his former slave owners, the country of his former slave owners commissioning a public work of their leader Jahangir shooting arrows at Malik's severed head. Now, do you see what I mean when I say that shows like this serve to help ignore and push African history to the side? It helps create the idea that only certain parts of African history are those that served and benefited from colonialism, so like Cleopatra did. Instead of talking about people from actual history, we've just taken people that are in popular culture and said, "Oh, you weren't there, you know. She could have been whatever skin color we want," and put black actors and actresses in their place without considering anything other than the politics of, clearly I'm not racist, I cast a black person. And to expand Netflix's problems further on, Netflix's own Self-Made makes the story of Madam C.J. Walker seem like she is fighting every single person, despite people such as Booker T. Washington, Annie Malone, and her lawyer Freeman Ransom playing large parts in the fight for equality. But Netflix's Self-Made would have you believe that Madam C.J. Walker did it by herself. Movies and TV shows like these are actually erasing large parts of history that tell their own narrative of some great heroine who doesn't need anyone and can do so wrong. Cleopatra's famous? Let's make her into a black woman so Netflix can advertise a black heroine while completely ignoring every other black man, black woman, and non-binary throughout history. Madam C.J. Walker needs a hero, so Netflix inserts some shifty black dude to prey on her, with her lawyer stabbing her in the back, and making her nemesis absolutely abusive narcissist. All of that so she can rise from the ashes of her own victimhood like a phoenix. This is despite the fact that Freeman Ransom, her lawyer, served the Indianapolis NAACP, helping to give legal voice to thousands of underserved African Americans. Her nemesis, and in the show it's actually called Addie Monroe, her nemesis is based off of Annie Malone, who helped build up a black community in St. Louis, opening hundreds of beauty schools, many of which are still open today, which all helped serve the African American community by providing a solid education that they could actually afford. Now, this is at the time when African Americans were actually segregated within their own communities, many of which did not have their own churches, their own schools, or their own higher education. Annie Monroe helped change that. Those schools helped provide a future for tens of thousands of African Americans, but Netflix would have you believe that she was a cruel narcissist, and they would rather ignore that part of history where African Americans lift themselves up in favor of a Christ figure. Madam C.J. Walker must fight a villain, so Annie Malone became Addie Monroe, who wound up penniless, so our hero can be perceived as more triumphant. Decades of black history are being erased for shows like these for the sake of good TV, and I have no doubt that Cleopatra will do its part to erase black history as well. That's honestly the kind of danger of these shows. It threatens to degrade and remove the beneficial actions of hundreds of people that frankly deserve the spotlight. And at this point, I wouldn't be surprised if the movie Cleopatra portrays the queen as someone who people bent over backwards for and benefiting Egypt, despite really kind of serving as conquerors, even as she wheeled and dealed for her own political gain, while ignoring the heroes and heroines of black history. Also, we can hear from our couch cushions. But if you like this, please leave a like and subscribe. And please have fun and enjoy.